Right, so for all of the pro-Israel sycophancy in Parliament yesterday, surely there had to be a voice of reason, a voice of common sense from somewhere. Someone, surely we elected someone who would stand up and condemn Israel for having attacked the Iranian Consulate in Syria, which led to the quite understandable retaliation by Iran, in which case for this attack on their sovereign soil, which is exactly what all embassies are. And indeed all diplomatic buildings are protected under international law in line with this. So the pathetic display of both the government front bench and the Labour shadow front bench condemning Iran and offering their support to Israel still, even now, despite what has happened already over the last 6 months at that, never mind this most recent escalation, and whether you love him or hate him, and there are solid reasons to feel both at times, when it comes to the Middle East and when it comes to Israel and what they've been able to get away with for decades, nobody quite calls them out with the truth like George Galloway does. And both Sunak and Starmer got the treatment as he stood as one of the few voices talking sense on this matter.
Once did he condemn that action, or indeed the actions of Hamas in the region?
Right, so thank God there was some semblance of sanity in Parliament yesterday, following on from Rishi Sunak's ministerial statement that put us on the side of the aggressors once again, and against those who had been transgressed against, as both government and the supposed leader of the opposition, who as ever appears to have no clue as to what that word actually means, both in lockstep with each other, as is far more often the case, in their support of the genocidal Israeli regime against Iran, who are always the enemy, have always been the enemy, will always be the enemy, but trying to resell that point after they were clearly attacked by Israel first is just nuts. And people can see it for themselves now, not least George Galloway, who is absolutely as straight talking and honest an authority on this subject matter as you could ever hope to find, even if you disagree with him on many other issues, on which I very much do. You can say and do likewise with Iran as well, of course. You could almost say they are the George Galloway of nations. Right on some things, not so much on some others. But where it comes to Israel, I do not begrudge Iran their right to defend themselves, as I would any nation who had been attacked by another, in light of the strike Israel committed on their consulate in Syria. And it is absolutely right that somebody should say that in Parliament. It's just a great pity so few voices were prepared to do that, preferring instead to put their own allegiances to Israel before the facts, before the truth, and taking the entire nation for fools. Galloway, of course, had a massive elephant in the room he was able to raise, because where politicians on both sides failed, and indeed Sunak's statement failed, was in raising the reason Iran retaliated against Israel to begin with. But of course, that is the narrative Downing Street want to set, isn't it? The media, British media certainly, have been doing similarly in maintaining this narrative as well, that the strike on Iran's consulate either didn't happen, or that the response by Iran was unprovoked or enormously disproportionate. I find this argument of proportionality to be a baffling one, frankly, because surely that depends on by what measure you're taking these things into account. How are you choosing to measure it? Israel targeted Iran's embassy and totally destroyed it, or a building alongside it, killing 13 people, and committing a world first in targeting a diplomatic building that was protected by international law. I could look at that and say, okay, Israel won't have used 300 and some odd pieces of ordnance to do that, so sure, Iran fired more weaponry. So on that singular basis, which of course is the point all of these politicians are making and basing their opinions on, Iran visited upon Israel a greater response. But they didn't target a single civilian area. They didn't target an Israeli embassy anywhere. They didn't kill anyone. And they didn't destroy anything. Now on that last point, that is certainly due to Israel's defence systems, and the point before it as well, you can argue. But then equally I can argue that to do any kind of damage or to make any kind of point, knowing about Israel's Iron Dome defences, they would have had to have fired more. If they'd fired 5 rockets, say, and they were quickly disposed of, the Western Netanyahu would have been giggling about it. So I don't accept this argument about proportionality at all. Israel attacked Iranian territory, sovereign soil, and Iran responded to that. As my old man used to say to me when we were scruffing around when I was younger, if you want to play rough, expect to get hurt. Israel got off lightly for what they did. They should take the warning, as should mouthpiece allies in our House of Commons, and leave it at that instead of once again escalating. But as I'm recording this, it's coming out that Israel may be planning another attack on Iran, so clearly nobody's listening and nobody is de-escalating, to nobody's surprise whatsoever, when this is the garbage our politicians are coughing up. At any rate, aside from slamming Sunak for not mentioning in his statement the very reason why Iran responded to Israel in the way it did, That small matter of that destroyed consulate building and the 13 people inside, members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the victims at that end, who some in Parliament now want to designate a terrorist organisation, perversely in my view, you're going to be made terrorists for being killed now, are we? Starmer didn't put Sunak on the spot over this either, failing once again in that small matter of being an opposition. But their self-defence doesn't seem to extend to Iran. It doesn't apply to them. It's just for Israel. And that segues this video nicely into tackling a rapidly becoming infamous interview now, as Galloway referenced in his oratory there in Parliament, referenced Kay Burley as the only person who has so far been prepared to put a government minister on the spot when she skewered David Cameron, forcing him to contradict himself within the space of about 30 seconds to a minute.
Well, I would argue there is a massive degree of difference between what Israel did in Damascus and, as I said, 301 weapons being launched by the state of Iran at the state of Israel. For the first time, a state-on-state attack. 101 ballistic missiles, 36 cruise missiles, 185 drones. That is a degree of difference. Yeah. And I think a reckless and dangerous thing for Iran to have done. And I think the whole world can see all these countries that have somehow wondered, well, you know, what is the true nature of Iran? It's there in black and white.
What would Britain do if a hostile nation flattened one of our consulates?
Well, we would take the very strong action.
And Iran would say that that's what they did?
Well, what they did, as I said, was a massive attack.
So they were right to respond, but they overreacted, is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that the attack they carried out was on a very large scale, much bigger than people accepted.
Did they have a right to respond?
Well, countries have a right to respond when they feel they've suffered an aggression. Of course they do. But look at the scale of that response. Had those weapons not been shot down,
respond, but they just overreacted.
There could have been thousands of casualties, including civilian casualties. I think that's a really important point to take into account.
Have you ever noticed how angry and how quickly he gets angry when he's put on the spot like that? He's always been like that, David Cameron. He's always had that air of, how dare you question me? Don't you know who I am? To which my response would be to call him a knowing liar in this instance and probably say something about pigs as well. But David Cameron, there was making all those same excuses all over again. Iran's response was disproportionate. Can you imagine the damage? But when flipped onto whether we were talking hypotheticals about where a UK consulate might have been targeted, well, that was different, wasn't it? Again, it's all about proportionality, and it's a nonsense argument. And as much as it doesn't grieve me to give Kay Burley some props, so often so awful as she is as well, she took Cameron to the cleaners, and that clip has gone viral, and rightly so. Because Cameron summed up not just his government's position, but Labour's as well, and how stupid it is. Again, repeating the lie about civilian targets. The targets were all military, the main one being the Nevatim Air Base, where Israel keep their F-35 jets, and where Netanyahu keeps his Wing of Zion Air Force One knockoff, but is also reputedly where a lot of US arms are being funneled in via as well. In the fevered minds of most of our mainstream politicians, it seems that only certain states apparently have the right to self-defence, and they happen only to be the states we have diplomatic relations with and are on good terms with, la-di-da-di-da. But coming back to Galloway, though, of course, what he happened to say there was met with laughter after he'd finished, wasn't it? Which, honestly, how anyone can wish to cast a vote for people laughing about this matter, that is beyond me. These people fear no repercussions, clearly, or else they wouldn't be so open about their disdain and disrespect here for the only sensible person in the room, not to mention all of the people he represents in his constituency. But all Sunak did was turn it around, not answer as per usual, and again make the non-argument about proportionality, but also point at Galloway and jeer, well, why won't you condemn Iran? Because that's going to be the new, will you condemn Hamas line now, isn't it? Can we expect Piers Morgan to now have that as his first question to ask on Middle East tensions with whoever is daft enough to go on his show next, I suppose? It's just childish from Sunak, especially when neither he nor Starmer condemned Israel when they struck the embassy in Damascus, nor in the interim nearly 2 weeks before Iran launched its retaliatory response to that. There was nothing from them. Where were the demands for Israel to pack it in, issue an apology, to make amends? There were none. So not only is this not about proportionality or even self-defence, this is just about taking sides and exposing certain politicians as massive hypocrites for doing that. Precisely how feeble and pathetic Sunak, Cameron, Starmer and others are has been exposed here. None of them are fit to represent us, when they are incapable of rational thought or holding abuse and warmongering to account, instead seeming more set on joining in. They're going to look like absolute idiots, every last one of them, when, as is being reported, and as I fully expected, Israel plan on having another crack at Iran. And they'll still be sending support and arms and aid and whatever without a second thought for the escalation they will in no small part be a part of. Whilst they stand there and make their speeches about de-escalation they clearly don't mean. Of course Israel's response does predicate upon one small matter. That's a matter of cost. They might not be able to afford it. This is something I dug into yesterday. If you've not heard about this story, it's hardly a story anyone is pursuing, but I've had a nosy into it. The finances. And frankly, unless the US are going to pick up the tab for the cost of increased warfare between Israel and Iran, even if they don't overtly get involved, as Biden has said, it might not be able to happen at all. Otherwise, you've got to ask, what if the US is giving all this aid to Israel and they still go ahead with it? Where's all this money they're getting, and why are they still getting so much in the way of financial aid? But aside from that, do we believe Biden wouldn't actually pay for it if it came to it? Well, there doesn't seem to be a limit so far. Another financial aid package on the way, apparently. But catch up with this story in this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.